Unity Mitford did not drift toward infamy. She hurled herself at it, arms wide, eyes blazing. Long before the gunshot echoed through Munich's English garden, before she became a geopolitical embarrassment whispered about in British intelligence files, she had already staged her own life as spectacle. She was young, beautiful, willful, and possessed of an appetite for extremity that the polite side of England neither understood nor forgave. What began as aristocratic boredom curdled into fanatic devotion, and the devotion then turned into tragedy. Few lives illustrate with such disturbing clarity how ideology can become romance, identity, and finally annihilation. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Unity Valkyrie Mitford was born on the 8th of August 1914 as Europe slid toward catastrophe. The date mattered less than the name. Unity suggested aspiration, synthesis, and almost mystical togetherness. Valkyrie was something else entirely, a warrior maiden of Norse myth who chose the slain in battle. Or in other words, one hell of a piece of determinism about to unfold. That said, the name was not accidental nor chosen on a whim. It reflected the eccentric obsessions of her grandfather, Bertram Freeman Mitford, a Wagner devotee and amateur Norse mythologist, and it hung over her childhood like a prophecy she would later attempt to fulfill literally. Even the family lore surrounding her conception, that it occurred in a Canadian town called Swastika, of all things, would later be folded into the legend Unity constructed around herself, half joking, half portentous, and entirely self-mythologizing. She was born into one of Britain's most notorious families, though the notoriety came later. The Mitfords were aristocratic but unconventional, wealthy but chaotic, and gloriously resistant to conformity. Her father, David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Redesdale, was a reactionary squire with a volcanic temper and a taste for absolutist opinions. Her mother, Sydney Bowles, was socially ambitious, politically suggestible, and indulgent of her children's eccentricities. The household they ran, largely between Asthall Manor in Oxfordshire and various London addresses, was less a home than a perpetual argument conducted at high volume. Unity was the 6th of 7 children. Above her were Nancy, sharp-tongued and literary, Diana, poised and formidable, Pamela, private and pragmatic, and Jessica, already sharpening her rebellious instincts in a direction diametrically opposed to Unity's future. Below her was Deborah, the baby, observant and cautious. The lone brother Tom floated between them like an ironic commentator, already cultivating the dry wit that would later mask his own extremist sympathies. It was a family designed for fracture, and Unity grew up keenly aware that affection was earned through distinction. Her childhood education was fragmented and indulgent. Like most girls of her class, she was taught primarily by governesses, though discipline was erratic and intellectual rigor somewhat optional. What was noticed early was not her academic promise, but her physicality. Unity was tall, athletic, strikingly blonde, with a mass of pale hair and an intense, almost unnerving gaze. Her eyes were described as china blue, a phrase that would later be repurposed, with chilling irony, by Nazi admirers. When she was sent briefly to Queen's Gate School in London, the experiment failed. Unity was unruly, disruptive, and provocatively uninterested in respectability. She scandalized teachers with obscene doodles, laughed through punishments, and treated expulsion not as disgrace but more as a confirmation that the rules simply did not apply to her. What she learned early, perhaps the most consequential lesson of her life, was that shocking authority brought attention, and attention felt just like power. By adolescence, Unity was restless and performative. She resented the effortless brilliance of Nancy, the poise of Diana, and the moral certainty already radiating from Jessica. Unity wanted something louder. She played table tennis with working-class boys in London's East End, raced cars recklessly, and cultivated a reputation for saying the unsayable. Politics entered her life not as philosophy, but as provocation. The early 1930s offered fertile ground. Europe was polarizing. Fascism and communism hardened into opposing myths, each offering absolute answers to a generation unnerved by economic collapse and moral drift. For a young aristocrat bored with teas and debutante balls, fascism came dressed in uniforms, pageantry, and transgression. Furthermore, the bourgeois fascists generally admired the nobility, unlike the communists who sought to shoot it dead in scarlet-tinged snowy wastes. In Britain, it was all nervously waved off as continental concerns. Nothing to worry about, the empire ticking over as always. This was a dangerous and blasé mindset, to say the least. Unity discovered, with a kind of delighted shock, that praising Hitler in an English drawing room had the same effect as throwing a lit match onto a Persian rug. Her mother's own conservative leanings offered no resistance. Sidney Mitford was not immune to the era's authoritarian temptations, and Unity found encouragement rather than rebuke when she began parroting fascist slogans. By 18, she was plastering swastika stickers on her car, greeting servants with raised arm salutes, and relishing the visible discomfort she caused. Shock was no longer accidental, it was strategy. In June 1933, Unity formally joined the British Union of Fascists, led by Sir Oswald Mosley. She did so alongside her sister Diana, who was already sliding toward Mosley as both ideological ally and future husband. The BUF offered unity structure, spectacle, and best of all, an audience. She sold black-shirt newspapers on London streets, attended rallies, and more disturbingly, delighted in abusing Jewish passers-by with slurs and chants. This was not abstract politics, it was cruelty enacted for pleasure. Friends recoiled, but Unity only intensified her performance. Yet British fascism was, to Unity, provincial and compromised. The true object of her fascination lay across the Channel. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany in January 1933, and his ascent electrified Unity. Here was a figure who combined theatrical authority, ideological absolutism, and personal magnetism. When Unity attended the Nuremberg rally later that year, the effect was seismic. The mass choreography, the banners, the music, all of it struck her as revelation. She later recalled that the first moment she saw Hitler, she knew there was no one else she ever wished to meet. Unlike most admirers, Unity did not settle for distant admiration. In 1934, she moved to Munich with a single purpose: to meet Hitler and secure a place in his world. She enrolled nominally to study German, but her real education took place in cafes and restaurants where she waited day after day for the Führer to appear. The Osteria Bavaria became her station. She sat conspicuously, reading, impeccably dressed, her blonde hair arranged to catch attention. It was a campaign of visibility conducted with aristocratic patience and near-religious faith. It worked. On the 9th of February 1935, after nearly a year of waiting, Hitler noticed her. He invited her to his table. They spoke for half an hour. Unity emerged transformed. She wrote to her father that it was the happiest day of her life, that she would not mind dying now, that Hitler was the greatest man who had ever lived. The language was not political, it was bizarrely devotional. Hitler, for his part, was intrigued. Unity's aristocratic lineage appealed to his obsession with class legitimacy. Her middle name, Valkyrie, delighted his Wagnerian fantasies. He learned that her grandfather had translated the works of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an anti-Semitic writer, into English and took it as a kind of cosmic endorsement. He began inviting her to lunches, dinners, film screenings. Unity was no longer a stalker, she was an accessory. Within a year, she was embedded and in more ways than one, allegedly. She appeared beside Hitler at rallies, dined with him frequently, and was awarded a gold Nazi Party badge, an honor rarely extended to foreigners. At the 1936 Berlin Olympics, she sat in a private box reserved for Hitler's inner circle. Nazi officials found her presence irritating, even risky, but Hitler enjoyed her adoration and tolerated her cheek. Unlike his German followers, she argued with him, teased him, and radiated a fervor that felt personal rather than bureaucratic. To Hitler, Unity became a living emblem, proof that his dream to seduce the English aristocracy to Nazism was achievable. To unity, Hitler became everything: father, God, romantic fixation, ideological lodestar. She referred to him always as the Führer, never by name, as though naming him would collapse the spell. This intimacy bred rivalries. Eva Braun, Hitler's long-suffering companion, despised unity. In her diary, Eva mocked the Englishwoman's legs and fumed about being sidelined, while Die Valkyrie monopolized attention. Unity, in turn, seethed over Braun's private access to Hitler's domestic life. The rivalry was never openly confronted, but it sharpened Unity's desperation to matter, to be indispensable. By 1938, Hitler had arranged a rent-free Munich apartment for her. She toured it with girlish enthusiasm, commenting on wallpaper, while its Jewish former occupants stood dispossessed nearby. Moral blindness had become second nature. Unity was no longer merely admiring fascism, she was participating in its ugly spoils. At home, Britain began to take notice. Newspapers reported on Hitler's English girlfriend. Unity fanned the flames, writing letters to London papers, defending Nazi policies and granting interviews to German propaganda outlets. In one, she warned ominously of, quote, the Jewish danger to all nations. In another, she praised Hitler's vision with evangelical fervour. The line between provocation and treason was blurring, and Unity did not seem to care. British intelligence, however, very much did. MI5 opened a file on her. Surveillance intensified. By 1938, senior figures within the service were openly discussing whether Unity Mitford should face treason charges if war broke out. No other British citizen enjoyed such personal access to Hitler. Unity, meanwhile, bragged to friends that Britain would never go to war with Germany, that she herself would ensure peace. She imagined herself a bridge between nations, an emissary chosen by destiny rather than diplomacy. But the illusion was nearing collapse. By 1939, the contradictions holding Unity Valkyrie Mitford upright were no longer sustainable. The fantasy that Britain and Germany could be spiritually united under Hitler's vision was fraying under the weight of reality. Expansion had replaced rhetoric. Austria had fallen. Czechoslovakia had been carved up. War, once an abstraction, unity treated as a melodramatic possibility, was now imminent. And Unity, who had wagered her entire identity on the impossibility of conflict, found herself cornered by the very absolutism she had embraced. She had always spoken in ultimatums. Friends recalled her declaring more than once that if Britain ever fought Germany, she would kill herself. At the time, it sounded like adolescent grandstanding, the kind of theatrical threat Unity deployed whenever she felt unheard. But the intensity behind it was real. Nazism had not merely given her purpose, it had erased alternatives. To live without Hitler's approval, without the world he represented, felt to her like annihilation. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Unity was in Munich. 2 days later, Britain declared war. The news detonated the life she had constructed. A friend later said the declaration was, quote, the final cataclysmic explosion which shattered forever and beyond repair everything that she had hoped and lived for. That is not metaphor. For Unity, history did not intrude gradually. It arrived like a death sentence. On the 3rd of September 1939, Unity dressed carefully. She took a pearl-handled pistol, a personal gift from Hitler, and walked into Munich's Englischer Garten, the city's version of pastoral calm. There, beneath the trees, she sat on a bench and shot herself in the head. But she did not die. The bullet lodged in her skull, stopping just short of a fatal trajectory. Passers-by found her bleeding but alive. She was rushed to hospital, unconscious, a condition critical. For weeks she hovered between life and death, drifting in and out of awareness. When Adolf Hitler was informed, he was shaken. According to Albert Speer, he felt personally responsible. He ordered that Unity receive the best medical care available and quietly paid for it himself. This was no propaganda gesture. The regime kept the incident deliberately low profile, anxious to avoid scandal and panic at the precise moment Germany entered war. Unity survived, but survival came at a devastating cost. The bullet could not be removed. It caused permanent brain damage, partial paralysis, and a profound alteration of her personality. When she regained consciousness, she was confused, emotionally labile, and cognitively diminished. The razor-sharp woman who had argued politics with Hitler and delighted in witty provocation now struggled to follow conversations. Her survival posed an immediate diplomatic problem. A British citizen gravely injured in enemy territory, known to be personally close to Hitler, could not simply remain in Germany. Hitler arranged her repatriation via neutral Switzerland. In December 1939, she was transported quietly by train, accompanied by German officials, and handed over to her sister Deborah in Zurich. The symbolism was grotesque, a failed martyr of Nazism being returned, damaged and dependent to the country she had publicly renounced in the most violent way possible. When Unity arrived back in England in January 1940, the press was waiting. She was wheeled through customs on a stretcher, her head bandaged, her body slack. A journalist asked whether she was glad to be home. She replied, without irony or hesitation, "I'm very glad to be in England, even if I'm not on your side." It was a remark so stark, it stunned even those accustomed to her provocations. There would be no repentance. Whatever the bullet had destroyed, it had not dislodged her allegiance. The British government now faced a choice. Unity Mitford could be charged with treason. MI5 had already considered it. Her public record, her propaganda writing, her access to Hitler, her declarations of loyalty would have supported a case. But she was also medically compromised, barely functional, and acutely vulnerable. A public trial risked turning her into a symbol, perhaps even a martyr. The state chose containment over confrontation. Unity was quietly removed from public life. For most of the war, she lived under discreet confinement, effectively a form of house arrest, though never formally declared as such. She was placed in a country vicarage, where doors were locked and windows barred, not out of cruelty but necessity. The arrangement was supervised, unofficially, by the authorities, and managed by her family. Locals knew her only as Auntie Unity, a vague eccentric with limited mobility and unpredictable moods. She was watched, cared for, and kept silent. Those who visited during these years described a woman altered almost beyond recognition. James Lees Milne, who saw her in 1944, wrote that her mind was, quote, that of a sophisticated child. She could still be amusing, still display flashes of Mitford wit, but the coherence was gone. She laughed at odd moments, fixated on trivial memories, and spoke of the past as though time had stalled in 1938. She retained emotional attachments but lacked context. Hitler, when mentioned, was recalled with vague affection, stripped of politics, as if he were a figure from a private fairy tale rather than the architect of the war. Physically, her condition worsened. The lodged bullet caused chronic infection and neurological decline. One leg was partially paralyzed. She gained weight, moved slowly, and required assistance. Her parents, whose marriage fractured under the strain of war and disgrace, nonetheless remained devoted to her care. Lady Reddersdale became her primary nurse, shielding her from inquiries and refusing to discuss her publicly. Around Unity, the war consumed everything. Her sister Diana and brother-in-law Oswald Mosley were interned under Defense Regulation 18B, imprisoned without trial as threats to national security. Jessica in America campaigned loudly against fascism and wrote bitterly of her sister's betrayal. Nancy maintained silence, retreating into fiction and exile. The family had become, as one writer put it, a civil war in miniature. Unity, once the loudest presence at the table, now existed as a kind of ghost, alive but unreachable. Rumours, however, refused to die. Almost immediately after Unity's return to England, whispers began circulating that she had been taken not directly home, but to a maternity clinic. The allegation was incendiary, that Unity Mitford had been pregnant by Adolf Hitler, that she gave birth in secret, and that the child was quietly adopted to avoid an international scandal. The story persisted for decades, resurfacing periodically in tabloids and fringe histories. There is no serious, credible evidence that it is true. Medical records from the period do not support it. Family members, particularly Deborah, dismissed it as fantasy. Unity's injuries were severe and closely monitored. A pregnancy would not have gone unnoticed. Yet the rumour endured, partly because it seemed to fit the atmosphere of secrecy surrounding her case, and partly because the public sensed correctly that much about Unity's final years was deliberately obscured. Science became both the family and the British government's default position. Unity lived another 8 years. They were not peaceful years, but they were quiet. She was moved occasionally between care arrangements, her condition slowly deteriorating. In 1948, complications from the bullet wound led to meningitis. This time, there was no recovery. Unity Valkyrie Mitford died on the 28th of May, 1948, aged just 33. The bullet that failed to kill her in Munich finally finished its work in a Scottish hospital. She was buried in the Mitford family plot at Swimbrook Church in Oxfordshire. On her gravestone, her parents chose an inscription heavy with, surely unintended, irony. Say not the struggle naught availeth. It is a line about perseverance, about faith in effort despite failure. In Unity's case, it reads less like a consolation than a tragic case of denial. In the years immediately following her death, Unity's story was softened, then largely suppressed. Britain had other things to remember, and the idea that an aristocratic young British woman had loved Hitler too openly, too sincerely and passionately, was uncomfortable in a nation hurriedly mythologizing its own moral clarity. When Unity was mentioned at all, it was often with a tone of pity rather than condemnation, a misguided girl, mentally unwell, swept away by dangerous times. But history has a way of reopening sealed doors. As archives opened and letters were published, the full extent of Unity's fanaticism became harder to ignore. Her anti-Semitic writings, her public declarations of loyalty to Hitler, her glee at shocking English society, these were not the actions of a passive victim. They were choices. That tension between her evident vulnerability and her unmistakable agency is what continues to trouble her story. The discovery of her personal diaries all those years later only sharpened the discomfort. Far from revealing political insight or secret intelligence, they documented something strangely more unsettling: banality. Lists of meetings, descriptions of Hitler's charm, effusive adolescent admiration in a tone that would have been more appropriate for a pop star, the absence of doubt, the absence of consequence. What emerged was not a mastermind or a spy, but a young woman who had mistaken proximity for meaning and ideology for loving acceptance. Unity Mitford's cultural legacy is necessarily narrow. She produced no art, founded no movement, left behind no constructive work. Her significance lies almost entirely in what she reveals about her time, and about the seductions of extremism. She stands as a reminder that fanaticism does not require ignorance, poverty, or exclusion. It can flourish in privilege, fed by boredom, vanity, and a craving to be chosen. In the end, Unity's life was not destroyed by war alone, but by absolutism, the refusal to imagine a self beyond a single idea. When that idea collapsed, nothing remained to catch her fall. Her story continues to this day, not because it redeems her, but because it warns us how easily conviction can masquerade as destiny, and how devastating the cost can be when it does. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this look at one of the most controversial figures from modern British history. Let me know what you think of Unity and the Mitford family in the comments, and what we can learn from her story. I've been Chester. Thanks for tuning in to Society Mysteries. Be sure to check out Hollywood Mysteries and Rock and Roll Mysteries too. I'll see you next time.